Reflex Action. In this module, we are going to discuss on the topic what is a reflex action, about the reflex arc, the different types of reflexes, and the Pavlov classical conditioning experiment. So let's get started. What is a reflex action? When a specialized tissue receives a stimulus, it may either directly or indirectly alter the reaction of other tissues or also the whole individual to the environment from where the stimuli arises. For example, the pupil of the eye changes its size when the light acts as a stimulus. When a pin pricks our hands or legs or we touch something very hot, we suddenly withdraw them. In such conditions, our reactions are instantaneous, involuntary, and very quick. It doesn't require much of thinking process and conscious brain control. These types of actions are termed as reflex actions. So, reflex action is a spontaneous, involuntary, and automatic response to any stimulus without the involvement of the brain. These reflex actions are essential to the survival of many organisms. Here, the major role is of the spinal cord and the nerve fibers, which is involved in this action, including a sensory nerve, a synapses in between, and a motor nerve. The pathway of the reflex action can be clearly understood through the diagram which is shown here. Reflex arc, a path which is covered by the impulses from the receptor to the effector through the sensory or efferent nerve fibers, a part of the central nervous system, and efferent or the motor nerve fibers is termed as reflex arc. Reflex arc is the pathway followed by the nerves which carries the sensory information from the receptor to the spinal cord and carry the response generated by the spinal cord to the effector organs during a reflex action, as shown in this picture also. These reflex arc are of two types. The first one is autonomic reflex arc. It affects the functioning of the inner organisms. They sometimes involve the spinal cord also. And the second is the somatic reflex arc. It affects the functioning of the muscles. Some somatic reflexes are mediated more by the brain than the spinal cord. Types of reflexes. Reflexes are involuntary actions. There are two types of actions which are performed by our body. One is the voluntary actions which are controlled by our will, and the second is the involuntary actions which are not under the control of our will. All the types of reflexes taking place into an organism can be divided into two main principal groups. One is the unconditioned reflexes and the second is the conditioned reflexes. So let's discuss about them one by one. The first one is unconditioned reflexes. They are also termed as natural, inborn or simple reflexes. It is an innate reaction of the organism which is the same among the members of the given species. For example, we can take for the unconditioned reflexes action like the salivation on smelling a very favorite food or even thinking about it, the closure of the eyes on seeing a welding light, the knee jerk on a sharp tap of the tendon below the kneecap of the crossing legs, withdrawal of the hand on touching a fire, withdrawal of the leg on pricking with a sharp edged object, sneezing, coughing, vomiting, swallowing, blushing. These are the few examples of the unconditioned reflexes. The second type is the conditioned reflexes. They are also termed as acquired reflexes. These are acquired after the birth and they involve some kind of learning. These include the playing a musical instrument, driving a car, or a crying or jerk hands by a child on seeing a very burning candle if the sight remind him of the burning sensation feeling even and simple occasion. The wild animals in the circus are trained to perform many very strange acts. They are really very largely conditioned reflexes, putting a shoe while we are having a talk or immediately applying a brake of the car when a very green light is automatically of the changes into a red color that time. So these were the few examples of the conditioned reflexes. Now let's just compare these two types of reflexes. The first one, it is about the unconditioned reflexes, and then we are going to talk about the conditioned reflexes. So in the unconditioned reflexes, they are inborn, inherited reactions of the organism, whereas the conditioned reflexes, they are the reactions which are acquired by an organism in the course of its individual development on the basis of the life experiences. The unconditioned reflexes are relatively stable, whereas the conditioned reflexes are unstable and may be developed, reinforced, or extinguished under definite conditions, a property reflected in their very name. The unconditioned reflexes are specific, that is, the characteristics of all members of a given species, whereas the conditioned reflexes are individual and may be present in some members of the species and absent in the others. The unconditioned reflexes are evoked in response to the adequate stimuli applied to a definite receptive field, whereas the conditioned reflexes can be developed under the action of the most varied stimuli applied to the different receptive fields. Now let's discuss about the very famous experiment about the learning, that is the Pavlov classical conditioning experiment theory there. Classical conditioning is a learning through association, and it was first demonstrated by Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist, in the year 1920. Pavlov showed that the dog could be conditioned to salivation at the sound of the bell if that sound was repeatedly presented at the same time that they were given food. So let's start the experiment. First, as shown in this picture also, before the conditioning it is, first the dogs were presented with the food due to which they salivated. The food was the unconditioned stimulus and the salivation was as an unconditioned or an innate response. After this, the Pavlov showed the bell to the dog, that was a neutral stimulus, and due to which there was no salivation because the food was not provided there, so no conditioned response was there. Then the ringing of the bell was paired with the food presentation in front of the dog continuously, and due to which after few pairings of the dog started salivated when they were heard the bell, even when the no food was shown to the dog there. As shown in this picture also, after conditioning, when the condition was provided to the dog with the bell and the food, and the dog was conditioned, so the salivation was there, and this salivation was termed as unconditioned response because the bell was ringing and the food was provided. After this continuous conditioning, the bell was given to the dog, that was a conditioned stimulus for the dog, and after that also the dog was salivating even if the food was not provided, and that salivation was the conditioned response to it. The dog had learned to associate the bell with the food and the sound of the bell, and salivation was triggered by the sound of the bell. So, Pavlov showed that the classical conditioning leads to the learning by association.